I move that this Council 1 recognises that ANZAC Day was commemorated on Thursday the 25th of April 2024, 2 pays its respects to the families of those ANZACs who tragically lost their lives during the capture of the Gallipoli Peninsula, 3 shows its gratitude to all Australian personnel who have served in defence of their country, and 4 remembers all Australians who have been injured or killed while serving.
And that's seconded. Your Honour, Mrs Henderson.
Mr President, ANZAC Day marks the anniversary of the first major military action fought by Australian and New Zealand Army Corps during the First World War. Last Thursday, April the 25th, was the 109th anniversary of the landing of the Australian and New Zealand forces at Gallipoli. On this day in 1915, before dawn, battleships, destroyers and troop ships with Australian and New Zealander troops on board approached the Turkish coast. Leaving the ships, they rowed the final distance to shore in the dark, landing in the wrong position. They found themselves at a 600-metre-long cove, a steep and difficult terrain surrounded by headlands, where they were met with fierce resistance from the Ottoman Turkish defenders. The purpose of the Gallipoli campaign was to force Turkey, Germany's ally, out of the war. The British had been trying to capture Constantinople, but was unable to make its way through the narrow straits known as the Dardanelles. The naval attempts were thwarted, and therefore it was decided for the troops to land on the peninsula to overcome the Turkish defences. 16,000 Australian and New Zealand troops landed at the Cove on the 25th of April 1915, and by the first evening, more than 2,000 people had been killed or wounded. When it was obvious the stalemate would continue after making no advancement over the next 8 months, a general evacuation was recommended. By late December of the same year, the ANZACs were successfully evacuated with little casualties. The campaign resulted in over 26,000 Australian casualties, including more than 8,000 who paid the ultimate price. At the time of the war, Australia was a young federation and was only in its 14th year. And for a majority of its soldiers who had landed in Gallipoli, it would have been the first experience of combat. Despite the failure of the Gallipoli campaign, Australians saw the display of characteristics in their troops that they would continue to identify with in later years of wars and conflicts, as well as crisis and hardships. ANZAC came to stand for positive qualities of endurance, courage, ingenuity, good humour and mateship, also known as the spirit of the ANZACs. And the spirit of the ANZACs is something that has lived on. As Arthur Burke, OAM, in his article pointed out, the spirit of ANZAC is not confined to the battlefield, but lives on in schools, on the sports field, and all over our great countries of Australia and New Zealand. Since the First World War, sadly, the world has known further wars and conflicts, all of which have been brutal and costly, often leaving permanent scars for those who have had to endure it, and impacting families, friends, and future generations to come. On ANZAC Day, we also commemorate the Australians who died in World War II and those who lost their lives in all military and peacekeeping operations that have been involved in since. It is a sobering reminder of the cost and brutalities of wars and conflicts. In a modern world of screens and digital world, it is a reminder of the reality that there is no reset button in war, that the costs are real. On the eve of this year's ANZAC Day, I had the privilege of laying a wreath at the Ceremony of Remembrance in Morphett Vale, where I saw young community members from the local youth and cadet groups keeping vigil overnight at the ANZAC Memorial. It was great to see the next generation recognise the significance of remembering and honouring the service of our defence personnel. On ANZAC Day, I had the honour of paying my respects, along with many others in the community, at the Colonel Light Gardens Dawn service where I laid a wreath. Today, Mr President, we commemorate all Australian and New Zealand men and women who served and continue to serve, and the sacrifices that they make, particularly those who have paid the ultimate sacrifice to protect our nation, our values, our ways of life, and our democratic freedom. We remember and we honour the sacrifice of all Australians who have served our nation in wars and conflicts. We honour their endurance in hardships and their courage to be daring in what they do. We are grateful for their willingness to serve and sacrifice for our country, as well as the sacrifice of their families and their friends. We will remember them, lest we forget.
The Honourable Mr Hunt.